Hi, welcome to session 3 of the third topic of the semester, Religious Utopias in the British Colonization of North America. So this is session 3, and we are going to proceed with now the actual colonization process that took place in the 1600s, particularly in that century, by several religious groups that crossed the Atlantic from Great Britain, particularly to North America, now in order to establish their ideal communities, their ideal societies that they believed were to be, again, the models of righteous living, the models for how humans needed to actually organize themselves and live on earth according to God's principles, but particularly that they were actually coming over to establish a series of Christian communities that, from their perspective, were going to live by the teachings, by the principles, by the doctrine, again, of original Christianity. In many cases, we're going to see again that the vast majority of those groups were Protestant. So we covered in session 2 the Protestant Reformation. Again, there is a religious upheaval, a religious revolution going on in Europe that started out with Martin Luther, the Catholic monk, the German Catholic monk, who wrote 95 theses or 95 reforms that he believed were essential for the Catholic Church to actually undergo change and undergo reform in a way that the Catholic Church will resemble the kind of church that Christ instituted on earth. Of course, Christ did not necessarily instituted a church per se as an institution, but he instituted a set of principles, a set of teachings, if you will, that were significant for people to attain salvation. So again, this is the central issue of Martin Luther and most of the Protestants, again, that are coming out of the Catholic Church during this process of the Protestant Reformation, is that the issue of salvation is central to them. And they are now reading the Bible in their own language. They're studying it, and they're coming up, with their own understanding of what salvation is and how a human being attains salvation. So therefore, they're all forming their own churches, their own Protestant churches that teach a specific method, teach a specific discipline that they believe will help individuals attain salvation, which means, again, salvation is just the notion that after death the soul departs from this world and goes into another world, and it can be either, again, heaven, depending on how one lived on earth, or it can be, again, a place of torment, depending on the quality of our actions, if we behave, bad to other people, with other people, and so on and so forth. We're going to see that once we move into the 1600s, there is going to be, of course, communities, religious communities, most of whom are Protestants. There are going to be some Catholic also arriving. There's going to be at least one Catholic colony formed in North America, Maryland, we're going to see. But now we're going to see the process by which, again, those Protestants and also Catholics are going to be arriving to North America, and what was their vision of the future. In other words, they had a specific vision or mission, if you will, as to why they were coming to North America. Okay, so let us assess that by now turning to our outline. So again, we're going to actually start here, but just a quick reminder here is that if you remember in the last portion of session 2, we were talking about England. We were talking about the Puritans, particularly how they were looking for the promised land again. So there was a surge for the promised land. And there's a sense among the Puritans that they have a mission. They have been given a mission by God to pretty much start the ideal community, okay, a city of God, okay. And so they see themselves as pilgrims in that they're going to be looking for this promised land. They're traveling from place to place, from France to Switzerland to Holland. In every place, they face certain challenges that push them out of those places. And then, of course, by the 1560s, they come to England, believing that England is the promised land. And as they come into England, I mentioned that the Puritans, believing that England had gone Protestant with Henry VIII back in the 1530s, when Henry VIII departed from the Church of Rome and created the Anglican Church, was supposed to be Protestant. When they arrived to England, they are now confronted with the reality that this Anglican Church was only Protestant in name, but in structure, in ritual, in meaning, in organization, it was almost identical to the Catholic Church. So there had not been any reform in the Anglican Church. In other words, this is still pretty much Catholic, just that it changed its name. And the King of England is now the leader of the church, not the Pope in Rome. So the Puritan communities in England are going to get very much involved in the politics of England, trying to reform the church, not just to establish their communities, to establish their ideal societies and the cities of God, independent from English society, but they start blending in English society, and they get involved in the politics. Again, in many cases, they go into the administration of the monarchy, and they're trying to create certain reforms from within, to reform the church, to transform it, to make it more Protestant, to remove all the symbols, all the rituals that resemble the Catholic Church. But I mentioned that by 1603, there's a new monarchy, there's a new royal family that comes to rule England, the Stuarts. And the Stuarts are Catholic, okay? They're staunch Catholic, they're from Scotland. And so they're now coming to England to rule England, and their mission is to reestablish Catholicism in the land, in England, to reconnect England with Rome, that is to say. And so they're going to, the Stuart kings are going to persecute Protestants. Okay, so there's going to be a persecution, ongoing persecution after 1603, that the Puritans will be much affected by, as well as other Protestants that were in England. And there is now, of course, some segments of the Puritan communities called the separatists that want to actually take on this pilgrimage again. They want to become pilgrims, leave England, and look for the promised land. They have given up on England. They have given up on Europe, just in general. They don't want to even search for the promised land in Europe. They want to come to North America to actually explore the land and feel whether this is the place where God wants us to be, and build our cities. So half of the Puritan communities want to stay in England and continue the reform process, even though there's persecution, but half of those communities want to leave. So this is again taking us to the story now of how the Puritans are going to be arriving to North America, starting in 1620. And once again, those are the separatists. They were known as the separatists because they just want to separate completely from England. They want to separate from Europe. They have given up again on European society, meaning that this intense effort to try to reform Europe, they believed that it was unreachable. Okay, this goal to reform Europe, the separatists, that is, that they believed that Europe couldn't be reformed. So they just want to start in a new place from scratch, away from all the troubles, the vices, the difficulties, the persecution that plagued Europe at this time. So again, this is going to bring the separatists, particularly starting with the separatists, otherwise known as the Pilgrims, because they're in a pilgrimage now, and they're going to come to North America. Now, how this process unfolded is that they understood that there were two companies created in the early 1600s, the Plymouth Company and the Massachusetts Bay Company, for the fur trade. I mean, those were London and Plymouth merchants that had, of course, gained concessions or legal charter from the King of England to actually operate in North America for the fur trade on behalf of England. But the problem is that those two companies had trouble actually colonizing the area from where they're actually building their company. So there were several attempts. They brought people over, but again, every time they brought people or a handful of families or merchants, those communities didn't last very long. Again, because it was a very, very cold environment, not very inviting. So it was very difficult to actually establish a presence, and it was very important to establish a presence. So the Puritans and the Separatists are going to volunteer in this regard, in terms of coming to North America as volunteers to actually settle and actually populate, okay, this region that the Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay Company were using for the fur trade. Okay, so they're volunteers; they're going to pay for their own expenses, etc. And transportation costs and so on and so forth. They're going to transfer certain communities, certain congregations are beginning to arrive as early as 1620. And this process will continue to unfold for the remaining portion of the 1600s until 1691. Again, there will be more and more Puritans arriving, separatists, many of them, to Plymouth. To Plymouth Company, by the way, it's a fur trade company. Now, as they're coming over, it's very important to note that when the Puritans were crossing the Atlantic to come to North America, they had a certain vision of what they were doing. Okay, it's not just the practical issue of looking for land and trying to relocate. Of course, they were doing that, but from their perspective, they see themselves as pilgrims looking for the promised land. And this promised land was not just going to be just any community among others, but that they were going to build the New Jerusalem. Again, in biblical terms, Jerusalem was the promised land of the ancient Hebrews, again, which in biblical terms, the Hebrews were considered to be the chosen peoples of God. Okay, in biblical terms. So likewise, the separatists, this branch of Puritans, see themselves also as the chosen ones, and that they're chosen peoples of God. They have the mission to build a new Jerusalem, a new city of God, a new godly city, that is to say. So this is how they see themselves as they're crossing the Atlantic. Okay, that they're on this pilgrimage, on this journey, because they have this mission. Once again, that is historical. That is very important because they're going to reset humanity. They're going to actually start a new creation, so to speak, a new society, a new form of living that they believe was going to serve as a model for the societies of the world. That this was going to be a great godly experiment. Can we reset humanity? This is a new world. Okay, the Americas is called the New World. So we're going into a new world to build humanity from scratch, anew. Many of them believed that, because they believed that England was the promised land, but England couldn't be saved. Many of them believed that they were going to North America to build a new England. Okay, so in a certain sense, they believe we're going to transplant many of the cultural and social elements of England, okay, into this part of the world, and actually build England as God wants it to be, a new Puritan England, that is to say. That was this other aspect again as well, that some Puritans believed that they were to rebuild English society, to build a new England. But in a very biblical sense, they believed that they were indeed on this mission to build a New Jerusalem, and of course, the New Jerusalem implied that they were to build a godly city for the chosen peoples. So when they arrived, the members, the first pilgrims arriving to Plymouth, agreed to sign a pact, because this is going to seal their wills, to seal their faith, their mission. They're going to unite their intentions as to why they were coming to build this community in Plymouth Colony, that is. And this came in the form of the so-called Mayflower Pact. Mayflower being the name of the ship that they were traveling, to the New World. And so they wrote a document in which everybody signed. And in very general sense, of course, there's so many aspects of the Mayflower Pact. It kind of established the principles of democracy, in which everybody was going to participate in decision making, agree, etc. Yes, it's true. But in religious terms, what the Mayflower Pact also indicated is that they all agreed that this was not going to be just any colony, any society, but it was going to be a society of saints that was reserved only for the saved, the people who had attained salvation or sainthood, that is to say, the state of grace. That this is why we're building the community. Okay, so we all, again, are going to just be members of this Puritan faith, and we're the chosen ones, and only members of the chosen ones, only Puritans, can live here, because this society is going to be a society for people who are striving or working diligently for their salvation. Okay? It's extremely important to understand that. Okay? A society of saints, in other words. That's the original intent. Now, this is going to change over time, because there's always change in history, but that was the vision, again, of the separatists that came to North America. Okay. Once again, a utopian society. They want to create this ideal society of saints. So, also, there's yet another vision that they're holding as they're crossing the Atlantic. And this is something that not only the Puritans, are envisioning, but virtually many of the religious groups, many of the religious organizations that will come from Europe to America, they hold a very similar vision, and that is many of the religious organizations and groups that are coming to America also believe that they have been given the mission by God to evangelize the Native American population. What that means is that they were coming to America to spread Christianity, save souls, convert the natives to the Christian faith, thereby, in their minds, helping accelerate the second coming of Christ. Okay, so the discovery of America in 1492 was significant in Europe, in that, among many other things, of course, there's so many different, of course, aspects that Europeans were thinking about the American continent, the discovery. But one of those aspects, what Europeans were thinking about the newfound land, this new continent, is that this was a sign of God. Okay, that the second coming of Christ was imminent. That is to say, because in Europe, for many, many centuries, there has been a prophetic tradition within the church, but all within Christianity itself, that holds a belief in the second coming of Christ. It's called Christian Millenarianism. So this is a prophetic tradition, by the way. Christians anticipating the return of Christ. It's called Christian Millenarianism. It's a prophetic tradition. The biblical prophecies talk about the return of Christ. And so what biblical prophecy indicates is that before the arrival of Christ, Christianity will spread all over the world. All over the world. So we have just found a new continent, Europeans said. So therefore, what this means is that, this is a great opportunity to spread Christianity into the Americas, thereby helping the prophecy come to fruition, because this is a prerequisite for the second coming of Christ, that Christianity must spread all over the world. So let's go and take Christianity into the American continent. So of course, this is the ideology, the religious ideology of many of the missionaries, many of the Christian missionaries that are coming, whether they're Catholic missionaries. The Catholic Church is going to send thousands of missionaries again into the Spanish colonies, into the Portuguese colonies, the French colonies. But also, there will be Protestant missionaries, of course. And in this case, the Puritans are also seeing themselves as missionaries as well. The Puritans. This actually set off the discovery of America, what is called the Age of Missionaries. And there will be tens of thousands of missionaries arriving from the 1500s all the way to the 1700s and beyond to the Americas to spread Christianity all over the continent, by the way, and convert the Native American population, by the way. So the Puritans are also going to be working diligently in this endeavor, that we need to convert the natives as well. This is one of their missions, of course. All right. So now let's turn to Massachusetts Bay. This is going to be the second colony settled by the Puritans. It's a company. It's a fur company, trading company. And it needed settlers. So the Puritans are also going to sign up as volunteers to transfer some of their congregations, some of their communities from England to Massachusetts to live in Massachusetts Bay Company and create their own communities. Now, of course, they understand that this is a company, so there are certain rules, of course, rules of trade that they must follow. They can only trade, of course, with England, with the Massachusetts Bay Company merchants and so on. It's true, but they're going to actually create their own communities, according to their own ideas. So the company is not going to dictate to the Puritans how they should live, but rather they're being given the right to establish their own communities and form their own political and religious institutions as well. So this Puritan colony, it's very interesting that it was actually ruled by the church. So the political institution and the religion institution was one and the same, because the head of the church, John Winthrop, who was the leader of this large congregation that is arriving in the late 1620s to Massachusetts was at the same time the governor. Okay, so the governor of the colony happens to be at the same time the head of the church. So he leads the church, and he also leads the government, of course, of Massachusetts. So there's no separation of church and state. Okay, the religious leaders, the Puritan ministers, are all occupying the political offices, whether it's the governor or the council of judges or members of the councils governing the towns. They're all Puritan ministers, by the way. So again, this is truly a religious society, in that even the government of Massachusetts is also led by the religious leaders. Okay, and the reason for that is quite simple, and that is the Puritans, their intention is to really create a Puritan society. And the only way you're going to have a Puritan society is if the policies, the leaders crafting laws and so on, they're all Puritans. Okay, they're going to be governed by Puritan laws, Puritan norms, if you will. So this is going to be the kind of experiment as well, in that the Puritans are now setting up another colony in which even the state itself is going to be, of course, merged with the church, and through the church, the state is going to guide the members of the society spiritually, so they can attain salvation, so they can be saved, in other words, so there can be laws that people will follow that are going to guide people, to heaven, in other words, so they can be saved, they can be converted, and they can experience salvation. The state of grace, in other words, that's what saved means, is that to be saved is to attain the state of grace. And the state of grace is one of sainthood, that is to say. So this is the mission. Anybody arriving during this time to Massachusetts, that's what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. They're doing work. They're working, of course, to get things done. Of course, there's food that needs to be produced. There's the building of the communities and so on and so forth. But on a daily basis, there's church activities. Every day, there's some form of religious discipline or religious activity. People attend the church for some time in order to engage in biblical study, for example, and prayer, and listening to a sermon, and so on. Every day, there's dress codes people need to follow. There's codes of behavior, how people should behave with one another, and so on. So it's a very conservative environment. Men and women need to dress in a specific way. There's no drinking. There's no alcohol. There's, again, all of those activities are not allowed. Again, so this is a very ultra-conservative society, if you will. And those that report to, that they have been saved, that they have attained the state of grace after undergoing the disciplines, they have to undergo also a conversion test. In other words, if somebody says, well, last night I had this moment of grace. I experienced the Holy Spirit. I was uplifted. I'm now living in the state of grace. I have attained sainthood. So I'm saved, in other words. So at that moment, that person was called by the religious ministers in order to pass a conversion test. The person will be asked a series of questions. And after the person was interrogated, if you will, for a few hours or a few days, then the ministers will determine whether the experience is real or imagined, and they will confirm the conversion. That is, we hereby confirm that you are indeed living in the state of grace. Okay. That's the whole purpose of the colony. This is a society that is going to help people again attain salvation. So that's why we're coming here again. So only Puritans can again live here. Only the ministers can occupy the political positions. The political office is reserved for the ministers. And so you have to be a member of the church, full member of the church to actually live in Massachusetts. So what that meant is that if you practice some other Protestant religion, if you're a member of some other Protestant faith, you follow some other norms, during this time, you couldn't be part of Massachusetts colony because this is just for Puritans, that is to say. Puritans that follow the Puritan doctrine, the Puritan traditions, and so on, and they're governed by Puritan ministers in that craft Puritan laws, in other words. So this is extremely important. He says, kind of experiment that they're carrying out, but nonetheless, again, this is something that will continue for many, many decades to come. The kind of experiment in the 1600s, this utopian society, this ideal society that the Puritans are establishing. Of course, one of the greatest contributions of the Puritans, whether it's Plymouth or Massachusetts Bay, is introducing the spirit of capitalism again to North America, because the Puritans held the belief that economic success, building successful, prosperous societies, was a sign of salvation. That one way we can find out, they said, whether we're going to be part of the chosen ones that will be going to heaven, is how much prosperity we enjoy in this earth. So one of the things that they're going to introduce to North America is the idea that they needed to work very hard. Every single day, work extremely hard, be very disciplined, very diligent in trying to create prosperity for themselves and for their families and for all the communities, because through that kind of discipline, through that kind of work, and the enterprises that people will create in order to create prosperity, that this was going to save them, okay? That this was going to be a sign of salvation. So they created pretty much the attitudes, the norms, the behavior of a capitalist system in which people had to actually take personal responsibility, work very hard, try to attain economic prosperity, try to create enterprises as well to build prosperity. And again, this is going to be the spirit of capitalism that will arise much later, by the way. So the Puritans are bringing that kind of attitude, that vision, that behavior, so essential for a capitalist system, by the way. So there will be other, of course, utopias, religious utopias created particularly from people that stepped out of Massachusetts. There were Puritans living in Massachusetts during the 1630s that were exiled from Massachusetts because they questioned or deviated from the original doctrine of Puritanism. And since they questioned the doctrine or deviated, therefore they were asked to step out again of the colony. And they're going to do that. Of course, they're going to be stepping out of Massachusetts, taking along with them certain followers with them. And in this process, they're going to actually create their own utopias, their own communities that will over time become colonies, the colonies of Rhode Island and Connecticut. So again, this is very, very important that Rhode Island and Connecticut were also religious utopias, religious communities that were founded by Puritans who were actually exiled out of Massachusetts. So let's now look into Rhode Island, okay, and then we're going to actually examine Connecticut. But Rhode Island, this is a utopia that was founded by a Puritan minister by the name of Roger Williams. okay, Roger Williams. And as we'll see, in 1636, he's going to be exiled from Massachusetts because he actually incorporated certain elements or ideas from Native American religions that kind of began to alter the doctrine of Puritanism. And because of that, of course, he's going to be exiled. And as he's exiled, he's going to establish Rhode Island as the ideal community for welcoming people of all faiths. In other words, he really wanted a society in which there will be freedom of religion, that there will be no central church, no official religion everybody must follow, but rather that people will be simply practicing their own religion in private, and there will be respect, again, for that diversity and a colony of all faiths, in other words. So the background of this is that John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts, who's the head of the church, was very strict in terms of trying to preserve the doctrine of Puritanism as much as possible so it can remain pure, unchanged, unaltered in any way. So because John Winthrop was a firm believer in this doctrine, Puritan religion, as the doctrine that can save souls, that is to say. So if you change it, you're not going to actually help people attain salvation. So again, strict Puritanism, strict rules, strict regulations, codes of conduct, dress codes. Everything, again, was very much enforced in a very strict manner. And of course, religious intolerance, what that meant is that there was not the mood or spirit of tolerating other religious beliefs. This is a Puritan society, so this is again, people that believe in Puritanism. So if you start entertaining other thoughts, changing your beliefs, or you have some other religious ideas, again, this is not going to be welcome, particularly if you're a minister. If you have been given the mission to lead a small church, for example, in the town of Boston, Massachusetts, Roger Williams had been given the mission, of course, to have a church. He was leading a church. And so he was preaching there, okay, during the weekends, during the week, etc. They were very, very devout. But Roger Williams was also given the mission to go into the Native American communities and preach to the natives, try to convert them, in other words. And he's going to be very, very involved in this, of course, trying to spread Christianity, baptize Indian children, teach them the English language so they can actually read the Bible, study it, and so on. Again, so he's going to be very much involved in this missionary activity. As he's spending time with Native Americans, doing missionary work, he's also going to absorb elements from Native American religious thought. And he was very much fascinated by the vision among natives of the sacredness of nature. In other words, that the natives did not believe, as other religions like Christians, that nature was fallen from grace, that there was a certain sinful or corrupt aspect that was inherent in nature, but rather the natives believed that nature was part of God. It was God's creation, it was holy, it was sacred, and that even God was present in the creation. That God did not necessarily live in another realm, in another world, separated from this world, but it was very much connected. So natives had rituals and ceremonies that paid homage to nature, worshiping nature, giving thanks to the spirits of nature whenever they took something from the environment, whether it was animals or there were, products or crops. There was always thanksgiving to nature, blessings and prayers, etc. So he was fascinated. So he says, maybe this is what we need to learn from them. We need to learn how to take care of nature, how to take care of our rivers, how to take care of the forest and the animals, and so on and so forth. So he was fascinated by that. This is not to say that he was totally going native, although some people believe he was, because he still believed that Native Americans needed Christianity. Okay, so they need Christianity, they need Christ, but Europeans need their vision of nature as sacred. So he started preaching those ideas again in the pulpit when he returns to Boston, and he starts actually sharing his ideas about Native American spirituality and so on. And of course, some people were alarmed by those ideas, and of course, Roger Williams is going to be called upon by John Winthrop. There'll be questioning going on, of course. The truth was revealed that indeed Roger Williams was actually preaching, of course, non-Puritan beliefs, Native American. So he was actually in prison for a while, and he was given the option to step out of prison only if he agreed to step out of the colony. That is to say, look, he was friends with John Winthrop, so John Winthrop doesn't want to actually imprison Roger Williams permanently, so he's going to release him and actually ask them to leave, in other words. So he's going to be exiled out of Massachusetts in 1636, and now Roger Williams, of course, is convinced that there's so much diversity of thought. In other words, that there's not just one way of attaining salvation. That Puritans have just one strategy, one understanding, but there's so many different understandings of God. That God is infinite, and there's just infinite ways we can actually connect. In other words, find connection and find some form of communion with the divine. So as he's stepping out, of course, in 1636, he's going to go to the south of Massachusetts, and he's going to purchase land from the Nagarasan Indians in 1636, and he's going to found what is called Rhode Island. And here, his vision is to establish a colony in which there will be religious freedom because of the diversity I just explained. So religious freedom, he said, is essential for people to live happy, to live in peace. So it's important to separate church and state. Okay, the church and the state must be separated. So the state can simply govern the affairs of this world, the administration of the economy, whatever, the trade, whatever needs to be done in this world. But the church can govern the affairs of the spiritual needs of people in a separate sphere. Two spheres operating in different environments, if you will, not connected. So nobody has to follow the same religion. Nobody has to attend the same church. People welcome again. Roger Williams here welcome people of all faiths. That they're welcome. Even Native Americans, of course, were welcome here in this part of North America, in Rhode Island. Of course, so the significance of this is that this is going to be the first social experiment. Perhaps the first social experiment in history, in recorded history, that we know that there is a society, there is a community in which there's not going to be an official church with an official religion. Because when you look all over the world, okay, for not only centuries but for thousands of years, the norm has been that the religion of the ruler has to be the religion of the subjects. Okay? If the ruler has a specific faith, a specific religion, whether it's a chief or a king or a prince, etc., an emperor, everybody that lives under the rule of that person must follow that faith. It's almost the norm, so to speak, all over the world. But here, what Roger Williams is doing is separating that. Okay, that there's not going to be, of course, a central church, a central religion, an official religion everyone must follow, but rather, again, that everybody's going to simply follow their own conscience, their own spiritual inclinations, and so on. That's fine. So this is going to be important because this is going to lead up to, once the United States is independent from Great Britain and is beginning to form the Republic. The First Amendment, religious freedom, the freedom of religion, is going to be an idea that actually came from Roger Williams, came from Rhode Island. So this is going to be expressed later on in the formation of the United States, as we'll see. Now, Connecticut. All right, so just one second. Connecticut was also another colony that was formed by exiles from Massachusetts. In this case, the leader was a woman. Okay? And here, the issue was that what was at stake, the issue that led to this exile, was the issue of trying to gain some form of equality, or spiritual equality, and even social equality between men and women. That is to say, this is going to, of course, lead this woman by the name of Anne Hutchinson, Puritan, by the way, to actually question, of course, the structure, the very rigid structure that Massachusetts colony, this Puritan colony, had, that placed, of course, men on top of society, and women were subordinated and were excluded also from leading church activities. They were excluded from being ministers. They were excluded from teaching the Bible. They were excluded from being any form of guide or leader in any of the activities that the church conducted, in other words. So again, because there was not a sense of equality, if you will, within the church, Anne Hutchinson is going to question that, and as she questioned that, she's going to be asked to step out. In other words, she's going to be exiled from Massachusetts, and then she's going to go as well to the south of Massachusetts colony and also create her own ideal society that will be known as Connecticut, by the way. So once again, so the background of this is that only males in Massachusetts were allowed to be ordained as ministers, to teach the Bible, to lead a church, to preach, and so on, and again, women were excluded from that. So in the church, as well as in the state, which were actually one and the same, all religious and political office were held by men. And Anne Hutchinson is not, very in agreement with that. And she's questioning, of course, that male-dominated structure, particularly when she reports that she had been given the task, the mission by the Holy Spirit to teach Bible classes. Okay, she was not supposed to do that, by the way. So Anne Hutchinson actually was one of those Puritan students or diligent disciples, if you will, that was practicing the norms, practicing the rigorous disciplines of Puritanism, reading the Bible, praying, etc., doing all those church activities. And she reported that she had her own conversion experience. In other words, that she had experienced the divine. She was visited by the Holy Spirit. And during this conversion experience, that she had this spiritual, mystical experience, this communion, this connection with the divine, that the Holy Spirit told her to go ahead and teach Bible classes to children. Of course, she was not allowed to teach Bible classes in the open, again in the church, so she began to actually hold Bible classes in her own home and welcoming children after hours. In other words, not in the morning or in the afternoon, but in the evening. So this is something that continued for some time. That there were children attending her house every evening for a few hours, and she'll be teaching them about the Bible and so on and so forth. Something that she was not supposed to do because she was a woman. So at some point, of course, the community found out that there were so many children going to Anne Hutchinson's house, so it was kind of suspicious as to why children were going there. This is not something that the community as a whole knew. Only a handful of families knew that she was a good teacher, and so therefore she was teaching the Bible to the children. So of course the authorities, religious authorities, actually found out what she was doing, and she was, of course, now accused of violating the norms. That indeed she could not teach Bible classes because not only the Puritan faith or the Puritan doctrine prohibited Anne Hutchinson from teaching Bible classes, but what the Puritan ministers in this court, she's undergoing a trial, so there's judges. What they're actually indicating is that women were excluded from participating in the church because this is something that many Christian groups, in Europe actually believed. So the Puritans pretty much imported those beliefs, is that they believed that women could not participate in the church as leaders because women were cursed by God. In other words, that was the explanation. This is the official explanation. That women were not allowed to lead. For example, when you go to Europe, you're not going to find, for example, women giving a mass, in church or a sermon. For the most part, they're excluded up to this time. So the reason for that, why we always have males, of course, as priests and bishops, archbishops, cardinals, popes, etc., within the Catholic Church, but even Protestants at this time, for the most part, they're male-dominated, is because there has been, of course, the idea among Christian groups that women were cursed by God because they all descended from Eve. In other words, the story of Adam and Eve, that is, in the Garden of Eden. So there was this bias, this prejudice that said that because Eve made a pact with Satan, Satan crept in the form of a snake, talked to Eve, to seduce Adam. In other words, to eat the apple from the tree, from the forbidden tree. And so because Satan approached Eve and not Adam, the bias, the prejudice was that maybe women were closer to Satan, in other words. So they both together, Eve and Satan, made a pact, a covenant to seduce Adam to eat the apple, and from that disobedience, of course, we see, of course, the fall of grace, and they were kicked out of the garden, and now they were to suffer death. In other words, sin, suffering, and death. And so the bias was that, well, who's responsible for this? Well, again, it's a prejudice, by the way, is that they blamed among the Christian world. The bias is that, well, women, of course, were to blame. In this case, the first woman was Eve, and so all women descend from Eve. So because of that, women were excluded from participating within the church as leaders. Of course, there were nuns, of course, the Catholic nuns, but they're not necessarily, of course, preaching or explaining the Bible or giving a sermon in front of people, etc. Yeah, they're not. So the bias is, well, women are cursed. They carry the curse of Eve, and the bias was that that women were, witches, in other words. There was this idea that women were casting spells, they were summoning the devil because the devil had made a pact with Eve, so it was easier for women to practice witchcraft and sorcery and, summon the spirits of hell and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of witch hunts, by the way. For many centuries in Europe, women were persecuted, for witchcraft for literally many, many centuries. And 9 out of 10 people burned at the stake for witchcraft in Europe were women. This is a fact. It's a statistical fact, by the way. So again, there was this bias, of course. Here, she's almost accused of witchcraft as well. Because when she said, well, the Holy Spirit told me that to teach Bible classes, when she actually said that in the jury, of course the jury understood that to be a statement that maybe the Holy Spirit was not the one that appeared to you, but rather the devil. And you're disobeying, of course, the authority, so therefore you must be in cahoots with Satan and so on and so forth. So again, it was a lose-lose situation for her. There was no way she was going to actually win the argument, even though she was very, very bright, very intelligent. Nonetheless, the ministers were not willing to really, relax and listen to her and trying to pretty much see that there was nothing wrong with her teaching the Bible, of course. Absolutely nothing wrong. But again, this was a lose-lose situation, so she was actually exiled. She's not going to be punished in a physical way, in a physical sense, but she was asked to leave as well. The colony, she goes with a group of people. Many of them are friends and followers, and they go to the south and also establish a series of communities that over time will be known as Connecticut Colony. It's also Puritan. So they're actually Puritans, but here their ideal society is one in which men and women will be spiritually equal. In other words, that here we're not going to have a male-dominated society within the church, but rather women will be allowed also to lead, of course, the church as well. Okay, so gender equality, that is to say. So this is the greatest contribution of Anne Hutchinson, is to pretty much establish this tradition in the United States for women to gain more and more rights, if you will, equal rights with men, gender equality, that is to say, in which women were now claiming certain rights, like, well, we're all equal, we're equal in the eyes of God, and so on and so forth. Women are not cursed. That's what she was actually saying in the trial, that she disagreed with this idea of the curse of Eve and so on. And so here, there's going to be gender equality. The first feminist in U.S. history, Anne Hutchinson was the first feminist, by the way. Okay, so a couple of more colonies here that we have to cover before we actually end this topic is Maryland. Okay, a Catholic colony, the Catholic colony of Maryland. I mentioned in the beginning of this session that not all the religious colonies established in the 1600s were going to be Protestant. The vast majority are, whether we're talking about Plymouth, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Although, if you really pay attention to Rhode Island, it's not necessarily a religious colony, because what I mentioned is that Roger Williams is not really trying to establish a religious society, but rather a society in which all religions are going to be welcome. Okay, but there are certain ideas, again, related to religion, nonetheless, whether it's a certain religion governing the society or welcoming all religions. But here, what we're going to see in Maryland is a Catholic colony. It's not going to be Protestant. And this colony actually was founded by an individual whose name in England was George Calvert, although when he became a noble, part of the nobility, he was given the name of Lord Baltimore. Okay, so he's in history much more known for his noble name as Lord Baltimore. Catholic, by the way. And since England after 1603 is ruled by the Stuart kings who are Catholic, we're going to see that because of the religious strife in England between Catholics and Protestants that is going on, as the Stuart kings are trying to cleanse England from Protestantism, there's going to be religious strife. So even Catholics were persecuted, by the way. Okay, so in England, Catholics were also persecuted. They also suffered, of course, a series of violent attacks and so on and so forth. So this is a going back and forth, issue between Protestant Catholics. So Lord Baltimore actually was given a land grant that he's going to actually use to create a colony. So this is a large tract of land that he owns, that he's being given by the King of England, King Charles Stuart of England. He's Catholic, a Catholic king, the Catholic King of England, King Charles, for Lord Baltimore to transfer Catholic communities, Catholic families to this part of the world in North America to start a Catholic colony that he's going to simply call Maryland. Okay, so this is a colony owned by one man. It's a proprietor colony. He owns it, and his purpose is, I'm going to build a Catholic colony. So he transferred, of course, a series of communities to Maryland. He initiates the colony in 1632. The original idea was to be a safe haven for Catholics. Again, this is a place where Catholics in Europe, particularly from England, can take refuge, so they're not going to suffer persecution. This is a safe haven, once again, for Catholics. But over time, what Lord Baltimore realized is that, we are surrounded by Protestants, whether you talk about Plymouth, or you talk about Massachusetts or Connecticut. Those are Protestants. You have neighboring colonies to the north that are Protestant. So it would be inevitable that at some point Catholics and Protestants will have to meet again, whether inside of Maryland, etc., because again, there's going to be several groups arriving from England, establishing colonies and so on. And to the south, of course, we have Virginia, the English settlers establishing Virginia as well, who are Protestant as well. So Lord Baltimore, therefore, realized that the best course of action is to pass a certain law in Maryland for people to tolerate each other, despite the fact that over time Maryland is not going to just have Catholics, but there will be some Protestants arriving in the future. So what he wants to avoid is the conflict that was so common in Europe, in the conflict between Protestants and Catholics fighting each other. So he passed the so-called Act of Religious Toleration. And this idea is, look, the ideal society for him is to have people tolerating each other, particularly Protestants and Catholics, so they can live side by side. So again, this is a law that says if you want to live in Maryland, okay, you must abide by this law, that you must tolerate, okay, the people that do not endorse your religion. And what he's actually referring here is, you must tolerate Protestants, and if you're a Protestant, you must tolerate Catholics, that is to say. Let's see if this experiment works. Let's see if Catholics and Protestants here can live together, in other words. So again, this is another utopia. And Lord Baltimore originally creates this colony for Catholics, but over time he realizes that maybe what we need is toleration. This is what perhaps the world needs, to tolerate each other, to learn how to live with each other and so on, despite of their religious differences. And in this case, he's actually just referring to Protestants and Catholics. So again, this is another utopia, if you will, that is going to be very useful as an experiment for people to learning how to coexist with one another despite of their religious beliefs. that in Europe it was almost impossible. Okay, Catholics and Protestants were seen as the devil incarnate. They were accusing each other of being the devil. So most of the wars, by the way, of Europe from the 1500s to the 16 and 1700s in 3 centuries were religious wars, by the way. So this is a unique, of course, experiment that is going to take place in Maryland. All right, so now let's look at the last colony, the last religious utopia that was established by England in the late 1600s, and is Pennsylvania. Okay, Pennsylvania colony was also, just like Maryland, founded by an individual as well, who had been given a land grant by the King of England in order to bring his congregation, his religious group, to North America to establish his society. And in this case, we're talking about the Quakers. Okay, so this is going to be a Quaker colony. So it's not a Puritan, it's not Catholic. Quakers are, technically speaking, Protestants, because anybody that was not Catholic, okay, was considered to be Protestant. Although the Quakers are not really protesting, they're not really involved in trying to reform the Christian church, etc. Again, so they're not really Protestants in that sense, but they're considered Protestants because they're non-Catholic. But because they're not necessarily Protestants and they're not Catholics, they're going to actually suffer persecution in England by both Protestants and Catholics. And they were persecuted by Catholics and Protestants, by the way, the Quakers, that is to say. And the reason for that is because their beliefs were very different from Catholicism and Protestantism, radically. Okay, that in many cases turned Protestantism and Catholicism on its head. And that is that Quakers believe, okay, this is the Quaker faith, the Quaker religion, that this issue of salvation, in which the soul departs and goes to either heaven or hell, that was not necessarily so. They believed in the soul, of course, but they believed that no soul can spend an eternity in hell. Okay, so they said this idea that there will be a soul damned forever, tormented in a lake of fire for eternity. That's not the case, because the Quakers believed that the soul was part of God. Okay, so it was an extension of God, that is to say. It can be lost, but it can never be tormented eternally, because that would be like a part of God, of course, being tormented forever. This soul, again, was labeled or referred as by the Quakers as the inner light. Everybody has an inner light. And that inner light, what is the soul, is actually an extension of God. Okay, so God has extensions, which are all of the souls, of course, that are experiencing life in different forms. But we're all part of God. God lives within ourselves, in other words. Even animals, okay, by the way, have the inner light. So everybody, every human being, every living being, every creature, every organism that is alive has the inner light. Even a plant, for example. But animals and humans, we all have the inner light, in other words, which is God. So therefore, what they believe is that the soul can never be damned forever in hell, and that there's no, distinctions that are real between human beings. So this distinction that men and women are different, or that women are cursed because of Eve, they reject that as well. Women are not cursed. They have the inner light. Okay, they have a soul. They're connected to God. They're God. God lives within themselves. Or that our skin color will determine our differences. It's a superficial thing. Okay, or that a king or a peasant are different because one is a ruler and the other one is not. That is also an artificial distinction because both have the inner light. So again, this created the concept of universal equality. That everybody, every human being is equal because we all have the inner light. And of course, masters and slaves, the same thing. And of course, they even opposed the practice of slavery, because enslaving another human being was enslaving God. You're actually enslaving a part of God, in other words. So they rejected all forms of oppression in this case, in terms of, like, for example, slavery or the slave trade or discrimination between men and women or skin color, etc. So again, because of those ideas, they were persecuted in England by Protestants and Catholics, because the Quakers questioned the basic understanding, of course, of Christianity. And of course, because they were persecuted in Scotland, they were persecuted in England. William Penn asked for a land grant from King James to actually transfer the Quaker communities to North America to start Pennsylvania, of course. So he comes here in the 1680s to establish his Quaker colony. Of course, it will be a religious utopia, in the sense not that there will be a central church and a central religion everybody must follow, but rather that the Quaker congregations, the Quaker churches, had no elaborate rituals per se. People were simply trying to contact the inner light, closing their eyes, perhaps doing some prayer, contemplation, and just tapping into that essence, the spiritual essence within themselves, that is the spark of God or the inner light. So we're not going to see elaborate ceremonies or rituals or things that people must do, or they're going to be kicked out again. So Quaker religion is very open in that regard. And again, people are just conducting very simple activities. Again, just like, perhaps conversing or sharing ideas, contemplation, etc. And they're going about their daily lives by simply conducting, farming. The Quakers were very well known for establishing their independent farming communities and living, of course, that kind of life, throughout the colonial period. But what's most important is, because this belief of the inner light was so central to Quaker faith, Pennsylvania will be the home of abolitionism. In other words, this is going to be the first colony that is going to abolish the slave trade in Pennsylvania, and of course slavery as a whole. And most of the abolitionists, the poets, the intellectuals, the activists that are going to be fighting for the abolition of slavery in the United States, many of them, a great many, not all, but a great many, were actually Quakers. Even Abraham Lincoln was raised as a Quaker, with Quaker religious backgrounds, if you will, in his upbringing. That is going to influence his thinking about slavery. And once he becomes president, of course, one of the missions of Lincoln, as we'll see at the end of the semester, is, of course, to end the institution. So the great contribution here of the Quakers, of course, will be, of course, the abolitionist cause, the home of abolitionists, abolish slavery, precisely because they believed that enslaving a human being was enslaving God. You're enslaving God, in other words, because God lives within every living being, humans or animals, etc. Okay, so in summary, we got about 5 religious colonies or utopias established in the 1600s. We got, again, the Puritans coming to Massachusetts to establish the spirit of capitalism. Okay, so the Puritans introduce this idea of the work ethic, work as a religious duty, to demonstrate salvation, that prosperity was a sign of salvation. So, and they created enterprises. They were very industrious, very diligent in their work. And eventually, that ethic will become an economic system known as capitalism, by the way. So this is a great contribution. Rhode Island, of course, the separation of church and state. This is the great contribution of Rhode Island, again, a colony that welcomed all faiths and separating the church and the state. Freedom of religion, freedom of thought, okay, so essential for understanding the United States. Puritan, again, Connecticut. Gender equality, this idea that the genders are equal. Again, there's no distinctions and so on, by Hutchinson. Catholic Maryland, the idea of religious toleration, Protestants and Catholics living together side by side, tolerating each other, very important. And Quaker Pennsylvania, the hope of abolitionism, another very important legacy of the Quakers in the shaping of the United States, of course. Okay, so that's all I have for you. The key terms, again, this is going to only have key terms at the end. So there's now going to be a series of questions. Key terms are essential for the first exam. All the exams are going to have key terms from one of the topics. So this topic on the religious utopias is going to actually ask students to elaborate on certain key terms that we discussed in this topic, whether it's Luther and the Protestant Reformation, or Calvin and the Puritans, Roger Williams, Anne Hutchinson, and William Penn. Okay, so this is extremely important. This is how, again, we're going to craft the exam. If you have any questions, please let me know. This is the end of session 3. This is the end of this topic, the third topic, and we're actually moving into the colonial period. As we move into the fourth topic, we're actually going to start again a whole new topic, moving into now the colonial period itself. Okay, that's all I have for you. Thank you.